Of all the grandfathers on this ancestral ladder, it was Israel Stone who likely witnessed the greatest sacrifices and transformations in American history. Some might point to the Civil War as the defining period, and with good reason, but Israel not only lived through the birth of a nation, he fought and bled for it. Born in Rutland, Massachusetts, on April 15, 1749, the son of Deacon John and Elizabeth Stone, Israel grew up a man of the soil. Israel's background in Rutland during the 18th century places him at the heart of a growing revolutionary sentiment. His experience as a farmer and a member of the local militia would have given him a front-row seat to the historic conflict. As tensions with Britain escalated, the need for self-reliance in rural towns like Rutland became all the more important. This feeling of independence reflects how ordinary citizens, especially those in rural areas, began to see themselves as part of something bigger than just their local communities. They began developing an emerging American identity. It is also worthy of note that his friendship with Rufus Putnam would be of great benefit to him after the war. This identity was partially created by the militia system that had become so crucial to the early American defense system. In those days, it wasn't just about protecting homes from a possible British attack, but also about creating a collective sense of unity among the colonists. The requirement for men to own and maintain weapons made them self-sufficient, as well as underscoring the gravity of the struggle ahead, where every able-bodied man had a role to play. Many of these young men had already been called forth during the French and Indian War of 1754, therefore, they were no strangers to armed conflict. Israel Stone's life and experiences would certainly have been shaped by these local and national events. It's fascinating to think about how someone like Israel, from a small town, could contribute to the birth of our nation. As to their commerce capabilities, they also began to produce more and more of their own goods, thus becoming increasingly independent on trade with Britain. 90% of the colonists lived along the Atlantic seaboard, and was a predominantly rural society. In fact, most people identified more strongly with their town or colony than with Britain, or even with the broader idea of being an American. No doubt, someone like Israel would have experienced these same strong opinions as tensions began to escalate in 1775. Although the major conflict didn't erupt until 1775, its origin lay in the earlier power struggle between England and France over the control of North America, particularly the territory east of the Mississippi River. This intense rivalry would culminate in the French and Indian War. However, fighting a war so far from home placed a massive financial burden on Britain, which resulted in their significant national debt. To recover these costs, Parliament argued that since the war had been fought to protect the American colonies, it was only fair that the colonists help pay for it. This political reasoning led to the introduction of several unpopular taxes inflicted on the colonies. Since the colonists had no representation in Parliament, they saw these taxes as unjust and rallied around the now famous protest, "No taxation without representation." The more the colonists protested, the more the British government responded with ever-increasing restrictions on their commerce and daily lives. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act and the Quartering Act, further fueling colonial resentment. These laws not only burdened the colonists economically, but also infringed on their personal freedoms. Tensions continued to mount, and on August 1, 1768, Boston merchants took a bold step by banning the importation of British goods and refusing to sell them to the Loyalists. Even on the high seas, there was no escape for the Stone family from the bullying British. In 1773, Samuel Stone, from Framingham, Massachusetts, was impressed onto a British vessel in Boston Harbor and afterwards forced to sail to the West Indies. After several months, he was released and allowed to return home. Since he was a British citizen at the time, the act of impressment was perfectly legal under the current British law. To make matters worse, Britain then passed the Tea Act in 1773, which led to the infamous Boston Tea Party. With neither side willing to compromise, the stage was set for open conflict, and war was rapidly becoming inevitable. The so-called Boston Tea Party resulted in 92,000 pounds of tea, dumped overboard into Boston Harbor, at today's cost of $1.7 million. Then, at the most inopportune moment, Commanding General Thomas Gage received critical instructions from his superiors on April 14, 1775, to disarm the rebels and arrest the leaders of the suspected uprising, particularly Samuel Adams and John Hancock. The political and social environment between the British and the colonies had now reached a breaking point. All that was needed for war was for someone to light the match. The colonists had put up with the intolerable acts, the Boston Massacre, the closure of Boston's port, and now the growing presence of British troops in their towns and homes. Enough was enough, but the British failed to read the tea leaves. With resentment and anger at their highest point, the colonists began to view the British as an occupying force. It had now become a life-or-death struggle for their rights and freedoms. The spark that ignited this powder keg was the British attempt to seize suspected colonial arms and ammunition at Concord. When word spread that British troops were marching to confiscate these supplies, the colonists knew that their moment of reckoning had arrived. The metaphor of the powder keg fit perfectly. After years of rising tensions, the colonies were ready to explode into open rebellion, and it only took this single spark to set off a war that would ultimately lead to the birth of a new nation. So, the stage was set for one of the most pivotal moments leading up to the American Revolutionary War, the British March on Concord. General Gage's response to the colonial storage of weapons reveals how high tensions had really become. The fact that he attempted to cut off all outgoing messengers from Boston shows his desperation to control the flow of information and maintain the element of surprise. Then, Gage's field commander, Colonel Francis Smith, was given secret orders, only to be opened once underway, which added a layer of military intrigue. And yet, even with orders to proceed with utmost expedition and secrecy, the colonists still managed to get wind of the mission, thanks to their efficient and widespread spy network. That very night, even before dawn broke, militia companies throughout the countryside stood ready. Each man was at his post. In the flickering firelight of Rutland, Israel Stone packed his powder horn and musket, his hand steady despite the weight of what was to come. He traded quiet, determined words with neighbors and friends, farmers turned soldiers, who had already enlisted in Captain Thomas Eustace's company, under Colonel Nathan Sparhawk's command. Tension rippled through the town like a rising wind. Then came the sound of hooves, post riders racing through the night, shouting warnings to scattered farms and village greens. The alarm was out. The countryside could not sleep as they prepared that night. It was late on the night of April 19th, when Israel heard the thunder of hooves echoing down the Rutland road. Suddenly, 23-year-old Israel Bissell came charging through the village, crying the long-dreaded but inevitable warning, "To arms! To arms! The war has begun." As a side note, Bissell had left Watertown hours before, bearing his urgent message for all to hear. His first horse collapsed beneath him after a 40-mile gallop, but Bissell pressed on with another. Over the next 5 days, he would ride more than 350 miles, spreading the alarm all the way to Philadelphia. Meanwhile, General Gage's concerns had not been misplaced. The Massachusetts militias had indeed been quietly stockpiling weapons, powder, and provisions in Concord, and even more extensively in Worcester. Alerted in time, the townspeople swiftly removed the military stores, dispersing them into nearby villages before the British could seize them. Ironically, and almost comically, the colonists already knew that April 19th would be the day of the raid, despite Gage's desperate efforts to keep it secret, even from his own officers. Now that they knew that Concord was the primary target of the raid, colonial leaders acted swiftly. Leaders were notified, and word was spreading at an astonishing speed, so effectively that some towns as far as 25 miles from Boston received word of the British movement before the troops had even left town. By 2 a.m., the British soldiers began their 17-mile march to Concord. As the column of 400 redcoats passed through the village of Menotomy, the echo of colonial church bells began to rise from the surrounding hills and valleys. The countryside was awake. The element of surprise was gone. One can only imagine what went through the minds of the young British soldiers as they listened in the dark to the church bells sounding the alarm. At 3 a.m., recognizing the growing threat, Colonel Smith ordered Major John Pitcairn to push ahead with 6 companies. Under strict orders to double time toward Concord, they hoped to outrun the alarm and strike before the militias could assemble. But as the sun crested the horizon, they finally reached Lexington and were met with an unexpected sight: 77 colonial militiamen emerging from Buckman's Tavern and forming ranks on the Lexington Green. Nearly 100 townspeople lined the roadside, watching in tense silence. Nervously, the militia watched in awe as the British soldiers smartly formed a line like a well-oiled machine. What the hell was about to happen? In front of the militia line stood Captain John Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War. He knew exactly what was at stake and what might be coming next. Parker was outnumbered 400 to 77, outgunned, and facing trained regulars, but he wasn't about to let fear dictate his course. Thus, the militia made no move to block or provoke the British. Parker did not wish to start a fight, but he was prepared to finish one if needed. Then, he gave the orders that would echo through history: stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. A British officer then rode forward, pistol raised, and commanded the assembled militia to disperse. It was said that he shouted a more venomous warning: lay down your arms, you damned rebels. The two sides stood facing one another, the morning light stretching across the green, glinting off musket barrels. The tension was unbearable. No one moved. No one spoke. Then came the spark, both literally and symbolically, that everyone had known was coming. In the confusion, perhaps from the British line, perhaps not, a shot rang out. In that instant, the line shattered. Smoke filled the air. The British soldiers fired a volley, and chaos erupted. Militiamen scattered. Some returned fire from behind stone walls and trees, others fell where they stood. The rest of the world would later ask the same question that rang in the air that morning: who fired the first shot? But by then, it didn't matter. The war had begun, and the world would never be the same. The regulars then charged forward with fixed bayonets. Captain Parker's cousin, Jonas Parker, was run through as he stood his ground, vowing never to retreat. Thus, he became the first to die. After the first volley, the British charged as a solid line. Some colonials stood their ground, some scattered. Some of the British chased after fleeing militia until order was restored. When the smoke cleared, 8 Lexington men lay dead, and 10 more were wounded. The only British casualty was a soldier shot in the thigh. The fallen colonists were John Brown, Samuel Hadley, Caleb Harrington, Robert Munro, Isaac Muzzy, Asahel Porter, and Jonas Parker. Jonathan Harrington, who was mortally wounded by a musket ball, managed to crawl across the green to his home, only to die on his doorstep, in his wife's arms. Almost all the dead and wounded at Lexington were bound together by blood or marriage, a tragic reminder that for the people of this small town, war had not only arrived on their soil, but within their grieving families. The Stone family had their own within the fallen ranks. Anna Stone was the daughter of John Stone and was married to Robert Munro, an ensign in Captain Parker's company. Robert had been a veteran of the French and Indian War, but had died with the rest that morning. He was renowned for bearing the regimental banner at the 1758 Battle of Louisbourg in Nova Scotia. The deaths of these 8 men underscore the deeply personal cost of the conflict. The Battle of Lexington was not just the beginning of a war, it was a brutal, intimate rupture in the lives of tightly connected families. It shattered homes, altered family trees, and sent shock waves through the entire community. In the meantime, Colonel Smith, arriving with the remainder of his column, heard the distant musket fire and galloped forward to take control of the situation. Finding a drummer, he ordered the beat for assembly. Gradually, order was restored as the British column was reformed and resumed its march toward Concord. Little did they know the carnage and revenge waiting there for them. From a military standpoint, the colonial forces that awaited them in Concord were far from defenseless. A formal militia system had long been in place, originally organized to defend settlements against Native American attacks. By law, each community was required to maintain a unit, and all able-bodied men were obligated to serve. Out of this structure evolved the concept of the minuteman, a specialized group of militia members who were more rigorously trained and could respond at a moment's notice. One of the earliest Minuteman units was established in Worcester County, Massachusetts, where Israel was born and raised and proudly served as one of its members. Selection for these elite units was not taken lightly. Volunteers such as Israel were chosen based on enthusiasm, dependability, youth, marksmanship, and physical strength. They were told to have 3 days' rations prepared at all times in addition to their muskets, bandolier, 2 pounds of powder, and 120 musket balls. However, with all their preparation and readiness, the one thing they lacked was a central leadership hierarchy. Still, despite their preparation, these men were facing a sobering reality. If conflict broke out, they would be confronting the most powerful military force in the world. As for Israel Stone, he and his unit were already packed and prepared as they set out toward their assigned destination, Cambridge, just 57 miles away. Their orders had no doubt been issued with strategic positioning in mind, anticipating the movements of the British forces. However, as Israel marched toward his place in history, he was not alone. These soldiers were all homegrown, neighbors, relatives, and fellow Rutland townspeople bound by community and cause. In Israel's column alone marched his cousin, Private Jonathan Stone, born and raised in Rutland. Leading the way was his brother, Lieutenant John Stone, the company's second in command, and, like Israel, a great-great-grandson of the family patriarch, Deacon Gregory Stone. There was also Elijah Stone, Samuel Stone, and Samuel Jr., as well as Simon Stone, just to name a few. Another answering the alarm was Silas Bent, who marched beside Israel, heading for Cambridge. Silas left Rutland a private, but would rise to the rank of lieutenant colonel of a Massachusetts militia regiment. He was also a member of the famous Boston Tea Party. On a broader scale, Israel and his family were hurrying to assist even more of their kin, already fighting for their lives just 48 miles away in Lexington and Concord. In all, over 40 Stone cousins were marching toward the same destination from townships across Massachusetts. And unbeknownst to the British, the Stones were bringing hell with them. While their cousins were marching toward them, two of the Stones were already in the thick of it. Private Jonas Stone stood on the Lexington Green, after falling into formation alongside 76 others summoned by Captain John Parker. His daughter Elizabeth had married Dr. Joseph Fisk, a Continental Army physician who trained under Dr. John Warren, brother to the renowned patriot Dr. Joseph Warren. Just down the line was Joseph Simons, who had married another Elizabeth Stone, the daughter of Joseph. Nearby was another cousin, Gregory Stone of Framingham, a member of Colonel Abijah Pierce's regiment. Fortunately, Gregory's company had received the alarm in time for them to reach the Old North Bridge in Concord just in time for the bloody fight there. As the drama unfolded, Concord's Colonel James Barrett decided to march toward Lexington and meet the British head-on. After a mile and a half, they saw the British regulars coming toward them. This enemy column once again outnumbered the Colonials, who could only boast 250 at most. Barrett decided to turn around and march back into Concord and await reinforcements. However, the British failed to realize how fast the provincial militia forces were growing by the minute, as more and more Minuteman companies were arriving from the western towns to join them. Although scattered, their number had already grown to 4,000 soldiers from over 30 towns within marching distance of Concord. When the British troops finally arrived, they set about looking for the alleged munitions and supplies. However, to protect their route back to Boston, he placed one company on the South Bridge and 7 companies guarding the Old North Bridge over the Concord River. However, with fresh troops arriving, Colonel Barrett's colonial militia was ordered to take the bridge. As the militia advanced, the British quickly retreated. Now, the score was beginning to tilt in the provincials' favor. There were now 5 full companies of Minutemen and 5 more of militia arriving from Acton, Concord, Bedford, and Lincoln counties. Seeing that he had the advantage, Barrett ordered his men to advance, forcing the British to retreat across the bridge. Shots were fired as confusion reigned, and casualties began to mount on both sides. Rifle fire poured in as the wounded began screaming. One of those pouring lead into the British was Moses Stone, a veteran of the French and Indian War, and a member of Lieutenant Colonel Ezekiel Howe's regiment coming from Sudbury. Another from Sudbury was Micah Stone, whose father-in-law, Josiah Haynes, had answered the alarm earlier and had already been killed at the age of 80. Not far away was Gregory Stone from Framingham, who was now fully engaged in the North Bridge fight, and would soon be pursuing the British all the way back to Boston. Captain Isaac Davis from Acton, Massachusetts, was shot and killed at the North Bridge, thus becoming the first colonial officer to die in the Revolutionary War. As the casualties mounted and panic spread, the British troops found themselves trapped, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. Their officers were falling all around them, as they saw the increasing number of colonists firing down at them. They soon abandoned their wounded and fled. The British forces had finally had enough and began their march back to Boston. But the gunfire between the two groups continued throughout the day, with dead men all along the road. One stroke of luck was that upon reaching Lexington, they found Brigadier General Earl Percy coming toward them in a relief column. Now, with a combined British force of 1,700 men, they felt confident in reaching Boston and surviving. But the Colonials had reached a far greater number by this time, and the rain of lead shot the British down at every turn. In total, the Colonials suffered 49 killed, 39 wounded, and 5 missing. The British losses were even greater: 73 dead, 174 wounded, and 53 missing. By the time the battered British column staggered back into Boston, they were stunned to find themselves encircled by thousands of colonial troops assembled around the city, with more on the way. Before Lexington, the British soldiers in and around Boston had grown to hate the colonists, especially their passive defiance and outwardly quiet rebellion against British authority. But now this outrage of open rebellion against the Crown had become a nightmare, especially with their dead and dying littering the road all the way back to Boston. Unbelievably, the pride of the world's most formidable army was limping back to Boston, with their tail between their legs, humiliated and in shock. They had been blooded and driven back by what they had dismissed as a disorganized, ill-equipped mob. Worse still, they were now trapped, besieged by the very rabble they had so thoroughly underestimated. It was now that their frustration boiled over in brutal form. One tragic example: as the British re-entered the city, a 14-year-old boy was shot and killed. His only offense was watching them pass by. However, the colonials had successfully driven the British back into their stronghold. The question now was, how could they keep them there? Massachusetts provided the answer by calling for all available troops to assemble at Cambridge. In short order, the force swelled to 15,000 men under the field command of General Artemas Ward, all with the sole duty of keeping them penned up. The Stone family, including Israel, once again had answered the call to duty. But at this point, Israel and his company of minutemen were still marching from Cambridge, and had missed the Lexington fight and British retreat. So, they became part of the initial siege of Boston until the company was sent home to Rutland on May 1, 1775. In the meantime, Lieutenant Colonel James Stone, a veteran of the French and Indian War, was dispatched to Boston with a regiment from Worcester, although they didn't arrive until after the Battle of Bunker Hill. His two daughters, Jemina and Abigail, had already bid farewell to their soldier husbands, who were headed to Cambridge to reinforce the siege of Boston. More and more of the Stones arrived, one of whom was Jonathan Stone from Braintree, Massachusetts. After the battle, he enlisted on April 26 in Colonel Learn's regiment, taking part in the siege. This young man would become a very influential figure in the settlement of Ohio in the Northwest Territory after the war. Then, on June 13, 1775, General Artemas Ward, commander of the colonial forces besieging Boston, received intelligence that the British planned to fortify two unoccupied hills overlooking the city. If successful, this would deny the colonials any chance of taking control of Boston Harbor and forcing a British withdrawal. Therefore, the Americans needed to move swiftly to intercede. Bunker Hill, rising to 110 feet, stood at the northern end of the Charlestown Peninsula. To the south and closer to Boston was Breed's Hill, which stood 62 feet high. Though smaller, Breed's Hill offered a better vantage point for artillery and defensive fortifications. It was here, on the slopes of Breed's Hill, that the colonials chose to dig in, and where Silas Stone and his fellow soldiers would soon face the full might of the British Army. To properly prepare their defenses, Colonel William Prescott secretly led 1,200 men onto the Charlestown Peninsula on the night of June 16, 1775. Their mission: to establish artillery and infantry positions to direct fire on the approaching British forces. These men were from the regiments of Prescott, Putnam, Knowlton, Fry, and Bridge, with the Stone men scattered throughout. All during the night, the men worked under the cover of darkness, digging a square fortification roughly 130 feet on each side. They constructed ditches and earthen walls about 6 feet high, with an interior wooden platform allowing soldiers to fire over the walls. Despite their secrecy, the activity on Breed's Hill did not escape the enemy's notice. With only shovels and pickaxes as tools, the men set about building their fortifications at 11 p.m. that night. Undeterred, they were still at work as the British commenced their attack on June 17. Alarmed by this bold move, the British wasted no time in mounting a response. Within 6 hours, they had organized an infantry force of 1,500 men. Transporting them from the ships in Boston Harbor to the peninsula required multiple trips in longboats, a slow but determined effort that signaled the seriousness of the British intent. By 3 p.m., the British assault force had landed and was ready to march. General William Pigot's troops assembled just south of Charlestown, but even before the main assault began, they were already taking casualties from colonial sharpshooters. In response, the British sent a landing party into Charlestown with orders to set the town ablaze. The British then launched their attack on the colonials' left flank, anticipating a relatively easy victory over the recently arrived and presumed inexperienced colonials. But what awaited them on Breed's Hill proved far more formidable. The approach itself became a tactical nightmare. The redcoats were forced to march uphill through waist-high grass that hid treacherously uneven ground. Their formations were broken up by fences, many of them reinforced by the colonials with hay, brush, and timbers to serve as impromptu barricades. Laden with heavy packs, muskets, and gear, the British soldiers struggled to maintain order within their formations. To make matters worse, they wore thick woolen uniforms entirely unsuited for the sweltering June heat. Exhaustion set in quickly, and with every step, they came closer to the overwhelming fire of the colonial defenders waiting above. The colonists held their fire with disciplined precision, waiting until the red-coated regulars were no more than 50 paces away. Then came the fateful command, and all hell was unleashed. So many of the British regulars marched up that hill, many never to return alive, as their formation was shredded by the withering fire. The colonials, in their trenches and on the parapets, fired as one, as a thunderous volley erupted, tearing through the advancing British ranks. Within seconds, the Stone men reloaded as their company poured another volley into the next rank. The overconfident regulars, expecting a swift victory, instead found themselves mowed down by a storm of lead. Under the withering fusillade, entire lines of soldiers seemed to vanish. The attack on the wooden redoubt fared no better. Its defenders stood firm, and the ground before it was soon carpeted with the dead and dying. But the fight was not without its costs. 2 of Israel's former Rutland comrades soon fell to British bullets. Benjamin Reed Jr. was the first to go down, followed quickly by Willard Moore. 2 families in Rutland who would now be grieving. But there would be many more this day. Others from Rutland, such as Caleb Clapp and his brother Joshua, their faces blackened with gunpowder, their eyes fixed on the carnage below. Smoke curled from the muzzles of their muskets, the acrid scent of battle clinging to their clothes. Several yards away was a Stone cousin, Windsor Stone from Framingham, who was serving in Captain Thomas Drury's company. They had all reloaded in silence, fingers steady despite the pounding in their ears. Over the wall, they watched the shattered remains of the British assault, waiting grimly for the next wave. The British survivors of the first assault staggered back down the slope, blooded and shocked, to regroup and tend to their wounds. But the British were undeterred. A second assault force was quickly organized, this time aimed directly at the redoubt with renewed determination. Once again, they marched into the withering fire, and once again, the colonials' aim was unerring. And once again, they were cut to pieces. As the lines marched forward, they had to step over the bodies of their fallen comrades. Some British companies returned to the shoreline with as few as 8 survivors, many limping, all scarred. The slaughter was staggering, yet the battle was not over. However, the colonials were grappling with problems of their own. Leadership confusion, dwindling supplies of powder and shot, and a growing wave of desertions began to erode their defenses. By the time the British prepared for their third and final assault, only about 700 colonial soldiers remained on Breed's Hill, just 150 of them inside the redoubt itself. Below, the British lines were in disarray from the sheer number of wounded being ferried back to the waiting ships. Nevertheless, over 400 fresh troops were brought ashore to reinforce the attack, including 200 wounded men that were ordered back into the fray. This time, the plan was simple: strike the redoubt and crush the weakened defenders once and for all. This third assault would be carried out with fixed bayonets. As the British stormed the redoubt, the colonials fired their final desperate volleys. One of those shots struck Major John Pitcairn, a key British officer, who fell mortally wounded amid the chaos. But by then, the defenders had exhausted their ammunition. With no bayonets to counter the British charge, the battle devolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat. The redoubt was finally overrun, not through strategy or superior tactics, but because the defenders had simply run out of the means to fight. The British had won the ground, but at a devastating cost. The only weapon left to the Americans was rocks and the butts of their rifles, neither of which could withstand the well-trained British regulars. The provincial retreat was surprisingly orderly, allowing most of the wounded to be carried to safety and live to fight another day. However, the colonials were forced to abandon their artillery pieces and entrenching tools in their hasty withdrawal. By 5 p.m., they had crossed the Charlestown Neck and fallen back to fortified positions in Cambridge. The British now held the peninsula, but it had come at a staggering price. Though technically a British victory, the Battle of Bunker Hill delivered a sobering message to the Crown. The British suffered 1,054 casualties, including 226 dead and 828 wounded. Among the fallen were a disproportionate number of officers, a loss that would haunt their command structure for months to come. No other battle of the Revolutionary War would cost the British so dearly. Colonial losses were significantly lighter, though still painful, approximately 450 total casualties, including 140 killed. But most of their losses occurred during the retreat. They also left behind valuable equipment, numerous entrenching tools and 5 of the 6 cannons they had brought to the peninsula. Yet for all that was lost, there was reason for hope. The bravery and determination shown at Bunker Hill rallied support throughout the colonies. Even in defeat, the colonial militia had stood toe-to-toe with the mightiest army in the world, and blooded it. And just days later, a new leader would take command of the fledgling army, General George Washington. With his arrival, a new chapter in the struggle for independence was about to begin. One of the changes was the Massachusetts militia was merged into the Continental Army as of August 14, 1775. 2 years later, on August 20, 1776, each county in Massachusetts was required to provide a certain number of regiments under the command of the army. There were to be 90 men in each company. Israel's Worcester County was designated to provide 8 regiments. For the remainder of the siege, General Washington established his new command post at Prospect Hill. So well fortified was the position that it earned the nickname the Citadel. It offered a commanding view of Boston and the surrounding countryside. As of October 6, 1775, 2 of the Stone men were stationed there at Washington's headquarters. Silas Stone and Seth Stone stood guard there, while another cousin, John Stone, was stationed there at Winter Hill, while waiting to join the Fort Ticonderoga expedition. But with the loss of Bunker Hill and their valuable artillery, the provincial army was at a loss, as a stalemate set in. However, with the arrival of a new commander came a shift in overall strategy. General Washington's plan was straightforward: trap the 6,000 British troops in Boston, fortify Dorchester Heights, and use colonial artillery to bombard the harbor, forcing a British evacuation. But the problem was, Washington's troops had left their artillery at Bunker Hill. Then came a messenger of hope in the form of General Henry Knox, who had an unbelievable plan. So unbelievable that he was scorned for its very conception. Nearly 300 miles away, on the frozen shores of Lake Champlain, the solution to Washington's dilemma lay waiting, just there for the taking. In May 1775, Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen, along with their Green Mountain Boys, launched a surprise attack on Fort Ticonderoga. The poorly defended British garrison was swiftly overwhelmed without a single shot fired. While the fort itself held little strategic value, it housed a treasure trove the Americans desperately needed: over 200 pieces of artillery. Among those shaping the war's history was Nathan Stone, son of the battle-hardened Captain Zedekiah Stone. Born in Framingham in 1734 and forged in the crucible of the French and Indian War, Nathan was no stranger to hardship or duty. By 1761, he and his kin had carved out new beginnings in the wilderness surrounding Windsor, New Hampshire, and Rutland, Vermont. They received their grants from Governor John Wentworth himself. But no grant came without a price. As New York and New Hampshire each claimed possession of these borderlands, the Stones stood their ground, their loyalty tested by ink, rifle, and snow. And when Henry Knox came calling with his mad, magnificent plan, it was men like Allen and Nathan, hardened, experienced, and fiercely resolved, who answered. The genius of the Ticonderoga expedition was 25 years old, Henry Knox, a bookseller and self-taught military expert from Boston. As the Green Mountain Boys would tell it, they didn't start out as revolutionaries, they started as farmers, settlers, and sons of the wilderness. Formed by Ethan Allen in 1770, the boys were born out of necessity, a grassroots militia forged to protect local families from New York's land thieves and opportunists preying on the ungoverned frontier that would later become Vermont. But when chaos reigned and colonial authority disappeared, what began as vigilantism quickly became a rebellion. Among the fiercest were Colonel Nathan Stone, his brothers, and his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Waite, all of them patriots before the term was even fashionable. When so-called officials from New York began confiscating property and claiming dominion over the contestable grants, the boys stood their ground. Branded as outlaws, they wore the label like a badge of honor. Their defiance spanned decades, from the borderland struggles of 1740 to the birth of Vermont in 1777. And through it all, they weren't just fighting for land. They were fighting for the right to govern themselves. So, as it turned out, there was a revolution within a revolution. But then that's another story. In the meantime, convinced these guns could change the course of the siege, Colonel Henry Knox proposed a bold plan. He would select 58 of the finest cannons and transport them across hundreds of miles of unforgiving winter terrain, from Lake George to Boston, in just 20 days, but no one believed him. Undeterred, he marched north. Among the artillery pieces was a massive 24-pounder cannon weighing over 5,000 pounds, along with several mortars, each tipping the scale at over a ton. Moving them would require teams of 8 horses per gun, plus additional oxen. Their route crossed and recrossed the frozen Hudson River 4 times, through deep snowdrifts and treacherous ice. Despite the odds, not a single cannon was lost. After 40 grueling days, Knox and his team arrived outside Boston in late January 1776. Wasting no time, the Stones and their comrades hauled the artillery atop Dorchester Heights, under the cover of darkness, on the night of March 4. A different Israel Stone, this one from Oxford, Massachusetts, was one of the men who assisted in this arduous task of fortifying Dorchester. By morning, the British awoke to find themselves staring down the barrels of Washington's newly acquired guns, now aimed squarely at the city and the harbor. The game was up, and it was time to go. On March 6, 1776, the British commander gave the order, "Evacuate Boston." Over 120 ships departed the harbor on March 17, carrying with them more than 9,000 British troops, 1,200 civilian dependents, and 1,100 loyalists, all bound for Halifax, Nova Scotia. The siege of Boston was over. But the fight was just beginning. General Washington would soon become embroiled in a running fight with the British throughout New York, and the Stones would continue to pay a price to follow the great general. The British commander must have been quite despondent, having been forced out of Boston by a rabble, not long after being beaten so bad in Lexington and Concord. As for our patriarch, Israel Stone, he and his company would depart from the siege and return home to Rutland. Spring crops needed planting and tending. He would miss Bunker Hill and the upcoming New York defeats throughout the state. During Washington's retreat from Manhattan, Israel's cousin, Jonathan Stone from Watertown, had been mortally wounded on September 15, 1776. But Israel would not escape his own reckoning when he was called up for the momentous fight at Saratoga. Unable to annihilate the colonial forces, British General John Burgoyne developed a divide-and-conquer strategy in 1777. His idea was to isolate the New England colonies, which they felt was the heart of the rebellion, from the rest of the colonies by taking control of the Hudson River. For his plan to work, he would need to trap Washington's army with 3 columns of British troops. First, he and his column would move south from Canada, through Lake Champlain and the dense forests of upstate New York. Then, Colonel Barry Street Ledger would move his troops east along the Mohawk Valley to support Burgoyne. And last, General William Howe, already in New York City, was ordered to move north up the Hudson River to meet them in Albany. If all 3 forces had coordinated as planned, they would have effectively split the colonies in 2, crippling the revolution. But it didn't work out that way. Poor communication, logistical issues, and some key American victories threw a major wrench into the plan. In the meantime, Burgoyne's campaign began with a flourish. Recapturing Fort Ticonderoga seemed like a big win. It shocked the Americans and boosted British morale. But their early success masked a looming problem: terrain and logistics. The Adirondack wilderness wasn't exactly made for a fast-moving army, especially one dragging cannons, wagons, and supplies. And building 40 bridges took time, manpower, and resources, and time was something Burgoyne didn't have. With the facts as they were, General Washington issued the Bennington Alarm on August 13, 1777. Just like Bunker Hill, the militia units packed up and marched off on a moment's notice. They came from everywhere, and the Stones were right smack in the middle of them. One of those regiments was the 6th Worcester Regiment of Militia, which was now under Colonel Job Cushing. The colonel had served as a captain under General Artemas Ward's command on the Lexington Alarm of 1775. Now, as a regimental commander, he received orders on August 16, ordering him to march from Westborough, Massachusetts, to Stillwater, New York, a distance of 157 miles. Their purpose was to reinforce General John Stark, and upon arrival, they were to have been moved into position to support Colonel Ebenezer Learn's regiment. So, Israel was not the only Stone marching into one of the three most momentous battles of the entire war. Under Cushing's command were 4 Stones from Shrewsbury plus 8 more from other townships, all of whom would join their cousin Israel in this decisive battle. Even his cousin Lieutenant Jonathan Stone, who served under General Rufus Putnam, would remain for the entire Saratoga campaign. After the war, he would follow Putnam into the history books in Bellpro, Ohio. In the meantime, unbeknownst to Israel and his fellow minutemen, General Burgoyne had already sent a large detachment of troops to Bennington on August 16, 1777, a desperate gamble indeed. Burgoyne needed horses and supplies for his army, and he assumed Vermont was lightly defended. But he didn't count on General John Stark, who rallied a mix of New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts men. Stark's forces didn't just beat the Germans' Hessians, they decimated them, capturing hundreds and dealing a huge blow to Burgoyne's strength and morale. Stark famously told his men before the battle, "There are the redcoats, and they are ours, or this night my wife, Molly Stark, sleeps a widow." It was a brutal wake-up call because Burgoyne was now deep in enemy territory, far from help, and facing a people who weren't about to roll over. And this was the moment when his elegant pincher strategy turned into a slow-motion disaster. Burgoyne was now deep in the American wilderness, overextended, cut off from reinforcements, and facing a determined enemy. The decision to leave 1,000 men at Fort Ticonderoga, essentially guarding a useless post, was a classic case of overcaution that only weakened his striking force. Meanwhile, things were crumbling elsewhere. The British column under St. Ledger had stalled at the siege of Fort Stanwix. His local militia, an Oneida tribesman, fought fiercely until rumors of a massive American force approaching reached his native, who abandoned him. Now he was forced to retreat. But the biggest betrayal of all was when the northbound pincher under British General Howe never showed up. Instead of marching north to Albany, he chased glory by attacking Philadelphia, leaving Burgoyne dangling with insufficient troops. But Burgoyne, stubborn and perhaps too proud, refused to retreat. On September 13, he crossed the Hudson, a bold but fatal move. Now he was truly on the wrong side of the river with limited supplies, no backup, and a growing American force gathering under General Horatio Gates. As history would show, the Battle of Freeman's Farm was the beginning of the end for Burgoyne, and the American sharpshooters made sure of it. When Burgoyne finally learned about the American fortified position at Bemis Heights, he probably realized too late just how bad things were. Not only were the Americans only 4 miles away with a numerical advantage of 12,000 and growing, but they also held the high ground and were entrenched behind formidable defenses designed by none other than Thaddeus Kosciuszko, the brilliant Polish engineer. Still, Burgoyne pushed stubbornly forward. On September 19, he attacked at Freeman's Farm, thinking he could break through the American lines. But what he didn't count on was Colonel Daniel Morgan and his band of Virginia riflemen. These long rifle demons weren't your average infantry, they were deadly accurate from long range and used guerrilla tactics. Instead of standing in formation, they melted into the woods and started systematically picking off British officers, a tactic the British found dishonorable, but highly effective. Without leadership, British units became disorganized and vulnerable. Despite some tactical gains during the battle, the British paid dearly for every inch. Their casualties were high, and worse still, no breakthrough was achieved. Burgoyne couldn't move forward, and he certainly couldn't go back. That moment was the turning point, not just in the battle, but in the war as a whole. Even though the British held the field at the end of the day, they were bleeding badly, and the victory rang hollow. The British had never faced an enemy like Morgan's sharpshooters before. They killed at long distances and picked their victims at will. Reinforcements gave Burgoyne a temporary morale boost, but it wasn't nearly enough. He had lost over 1,100 men, almost 15% of his entire force. By contrast, the Americans had only lost around 320, and they were gaining strength by the hour. Every day, more militia poured in from New England and the surrounding colonies, swelling Gates's ranks and tightening the noose. But Burgoyne was stuck. He couldn't retreat across the Hudson, he had burned the bridges behind him, and his supply lines were cut, he was low on food, and his army's morale was gone. And still, he waited, hoping Howe would show up from the south or Clinton would ride in from New York. But no one came. Meanwhile, Gates was building a fortified wall of men and earth, with Benedict Arnold whispering in his ear, urging for a more aggressive response. At this point, Burgoyne was cornered, desperate, and running out of both time and supplies. With only 5,000 men left and his army weakening by the day, he made the fateful decision to go on the offensive one last time. On October 7, during the Battle of Bemis Heights, Burgoyne sent out a 1,500-man reconnaissance in force to probe the American left flank, hoping to either find a weakness or provoke the Americans into exposing themselves. But instead, he ran headfirst into a well-prepared and deeply motivated Continental force. Once again, Daniel Morgan's sharpshooters were waiting in the woods like ghosts with rifles. The moment the British entered the brush, the air cracked with musket fire. Officers fell almost immediately, and this time, General Simon Fraser, one of Burgoyne's most capable commanders, was mortally wounded. His death was a serious blow to morale and coordination. The British formation faltered, then broke, and as they pulled back in disarray, American forces surged forward, no longer content to be on the defensive. In the midst of the battle, Benedict Arnold rose up to rally his men to even greater heights. His men surged forward like a tidal wave and swept all before them. Benedict Arnold, despite being relieved of command after clashing with Gates, charged onto the battlefield without orders, rallying troops and leading a full-on counterattack that smashed through the British lines. It was bold, reckless, and brilliant. However, Arnold was shot in the leg, but his actions helped turn the tide completely. Arnold had ignited the American forces like no other. His attack was so fierce and relentless that it completely overwhelmed the British, forcing them to retreat to their Freeman's Farm encampment, the same ground they'd taken with such heavy losses weeks earlier. But it had been here that Private Josiah Stone was shot and killed in action during this same charge. Josiah was from Temple, New Hampshire, and was a veteran of the French and Indian War, Bunker Hill, and Ticonderoga. He had re-enlisted on March 13 in the 3rd New Hampshire Regiment under the command of Colonel Alexander Scammell, and had now paid the ultimate price for this patriotism. Sadly, in 1781, Colonel Scammell himself was wounded and captured at Yorktown, and while a prisoner, died of his wounds. Following the battle, Israel's company was transferred to General Jonathan Warner's brigade for the upcoming showdown at Saratoga. Another group under the same orders was Lieutenant James Stone of Weston, Massachusetts, now Warren, who served Colonel Jonathan Holman's regiment. They would be attached to General Warner's brigade as well, following their march from the town of Weston to Saratoga to reinforce General Gates' forces. The time had now come for the dramatic finale of Burgoyne's once grand plan, now unraveling before his eyes. The American troops, sensing the tide had turned, pressed their advantage ruthlessly. The British were exhausted, dejected, and surrounded. Burgoyne, now with dwindling food, wounded men, and no hope of reinforcements, made one last attempt to retreat, but it was already too late. By October 8, Gates had amassed 20,000 colonial troops, many of them fresh militia, and they encircled Burgoyne's entire force. There was no way out, just dense forests, armed Americans, and the icy breath of a northern winter approaching. And so, on October 17, 1777, in a tent outside of Saratoga, General John Burgoyne surrendered his remaining army of 5,800 men. Afterwards, Israel's commander, General Warner, received a personal letter from George Washington on November 9, from his headquarters in White Marsh, Pennsylvania, stating, "As the term of service of the Brigade of Massachusetts Militia under your command will expire with this month, it is not worth your while to march the distance to do a few days' duty. I therefore desire you will return to General Putnam, and employ your men, during your stay, in such manner as he shall direct. I imagine this must be more agreeable to his soldiers than coming so far from home at this season of the year. I am, sir, your most obedient servant." Private Israel was going home. But not all Stones made it home alive. Private Silas Stone, from Natick, Massachusetts, served in the 2nd New Hampshire Regiment, and after surviving the French and Indian War in 1757, he continued his military service in the Revolution. Tragically, while marching back to Albany, New York, with his regiment, Stone fell ill and died in Lansingburg, New York. It was not long after the battle that captured British soldiers were being sent to Israel's hometown of Rutland on October 17, 1777. Imagine being Israel, a young man who had just fought and lost friends and cousins in the greatest battle, now seeing enemy soldiers not only housed in his hometown, but in some cases living comfortably among his own townspeople. It must have completely enraged Israel, casting a shadow of betrayal or bitterness. Ironically, Israel's cousin Simeon Stone, a native of Rutland, served a short time as a guard at the Rutland POW prison. He was deployed from July 1 to October 1779, having served in Captain Joseph Livermore's company. He would pass away in his hometown in 1785. Another homegrown soldier was Major Daniel Clapp, husband of Susan Muzzy. He was the assistant regimental commissary officer at Rutland in 1779. He also signed a certificate stating that he had not issued any sauce to the guards since he took the position on August 17, 1779. It makes you wonder, were the guards complaining about their sauce? Regardless, orders were orders, and the barracks had been built on Barracks Hill, a huge building for the day at 120 feet by 40 feet, 2 stories, and 24 rooms filled with bunks. At one time, it housed up to 3,000 prisoners, a staggering number when you picture the size of a rural town like Rutland back then. That was not just a small group, that was practically an invasion of prisoners overwhelming the small community. And of course, the captured British officers were treated totally differently from the common soldiers. They had privileges like waiters for their meals, horses, and the freedom to socialize, especially with the town's young women, of whom 3 would marry. So, you can just imagine how that created even more tension among the locals. But it's amazing to think about how prisoners of war like John Luke could start as an enemy soldier, then stayed on after the war and married a local girl, Betsy Stone. Luke's journey would take him from Germany to Bennington, to Rutland, then Vermont, New York, and finally Ontario, thus showing how mobile and resilient these early settlers were. Even the non-commissioned officers had the freedom to walk into town and supplement their rations, which sounds almost shockingly humane, especially when you compare it to the brutal conditions inflicted on the American POWs aboard the British prison ships, where they suffered and died in horrible numbers. It's a powerful contrast, the difference between surviving in luxury and slowly wasting away in misery. But regardless of what side you fought for, Saratoga was not just a battlefield victory, it was the domino that tipped the whole global balance. Before Saratoga, the revolution looked like a long shot, almost a rebellion doomed to be crushed. But after the American victory, the world's perception shifted dramatically. France saw that the American cause wasn't a lost endeavor, it was an opportunity to weaken their old rival, Britain. And once France committed, it opened the door for Spain and the Dutch Republic to get involved too, which stretched British resources too thin across the globe. It's fascinating to think that without Saratoga, we might never have seen Yorktown, never forced the British surrender, and maybe never had the United States as we know it. The Battle of Saratoga turned what was a colonial uprising into a truly international conflict and forced the tide of history with the American victory in September 1783. And the idea that so many of those who stood on Lexington Green, plus 435 others throughout Massachusetts, were all descendants of Deacon Gregory Stone. This alone gives the Revolution such a personal, almost ancestral weight. It wasn't just nameless patriots fighting for independence, it was families, lineages, and communities deeply intertwined, all standing up together. Now that the war was over and the battles were won, the hardest work remained, picking up the pieces, mourning the lost, caring for the wounded, rebuilding lives and farms and futures. War might end with treaties, but for families, the recovery stretches on for years, sometimes generations. When Israel finally came back home, everything was different. His father, Deacon John Stone, had been a respected leader, justice of the peace, deacon, and surveyor, and now he was gone. His father's carefully built life and legacy was now in the hands of his children. Everything he had worked for was divided up according to his will, which spoke of the realities of 18th-century family dynamics, an inheritance protocol that fell onto Israel and his brother John to carry on the family legacy. The soldiers were now marching home, no more battles, bivouacs, deprivation, and back pay that never came. Now what?